Gentlemen, I'm very honored to chair this meeting this morning for our talk from Gidon Elazar on being Jewish in China, the current situation of the Kaifeng Jews. I think it's fair to say that I've known Gidon all his life, and any resemblance between Gidon and Daniel Elazar in the picture is not coincidental. Gidon is a doctoral student in East Asian department at Haifa University. He has spent several years in China studying Chinese and conducting anthropological research in the southwestern province of Yunnan. His doctoral research deals with the current activities of Christian missionaries in Yunnan and the relationship between religion, ethnicity, and state policy in the increasingly globalized China. I just asked Gidon when he's submitting his PhD, so he said he remembers that 10 years ago the Americans said, "This is our last year in Afghanistan." And they've been saying that every year for the last 10 years. So. And on that note, I pass the microphone.
Okay. First of all, I'm happy to be here. It's an honor to be back in this library where I worked for a year, actually. I worked here as a librarian. It's nice to... I'm saying I worked here as a librarian, so it's nice to be back in this library on this wall this time. Used to sit over there. I'm going to talk today about the Jews of Kaifeng. Try and give some historical background first, give you a little bit of a concept of how they got there and how they stayed there, and then kind of part two will be what there is there today and how we can understand something about the existence of Judaism there in China in the context of contemporary China, Reform era China, what we call post-Maoist China. So let's start with a little bit of background, a little bit of history. So this is can't really see it very well, unfortunately. Yeah. Okay, there you go. This is a very famous scroll. The reason I'm opening with this is because this is a very famous scroll of Kaifeng. This is a picture of a painting of Kaifeng from around the era where when the Jews got there. The Song. A number of Jewish communities in China. We know from Marco Polo that there were communities in other places in China, in Hangzhou and other places, but surprisingly, the only community that survived was the community of Kaifeng. There's really no way of knowing why, but I'll try and theorize a little bit about why exactly they survived. In 1163, the synagogue was established. We have here these are the steles. Where the arrival of the Jews is documented. There's kind of a history of Jewish history from Abraham through Ezra. These steles exist in the Kaifeng Museum. I'll talk about them later. I don't want to spend too much time on the ancient history. Just to say, this is what the things that the steles express. Loyalty to the emperor, and like all religions in China, they try and show how Judaism is compatible with the Confucian tradition, and these are the prized artifacts of the community. As I will show later, there's actually almost nothing left, and this is almost the only thing that is left in Kaifeng. They're kept in the museum, in the Municipal Museum of Kaifeng. I'd like to jump forward a little bit. I should say the Jewish community in Kaifeng was never very large. or particularly important. Really, the only reason that it's caused so much interest is because of its exotic. It's because of it being so far away from, being at the edge of the world from a Jewish perspective. And what happened is that in the late 14th century, the Silk Route was closed. As a result, the Mongolians, who were those who maintained the Silk Route, were kicked out of China. A new dynasty came, the Ming dynasty, and the Ming dynasty gradually closed China for all kinds of reasons we won't go into today. And so basically the Kaifeng Jews were detached from the Jewish world for hundreds and hundreds of years. Nobody knew about them. We don't find any references to them in any Jewish texts. As far as I know, maybe somebody who knows better can correct me, but as far as I know, nobody knew about them. The person who discovered them in 1605, and I want to tell you the story because I think it says a lot about the community, is this guy, Matteo Ricci. He was a very famous Jesuit missionary, the first Jesuit missionary to China, was responsible for translating a lot of the Confucian texts. He was also the one who coined the term Confucius. If you ever wondered why he has a Latin name, it's because the Jesuits, Latin-sounding name, it's because the Jesuits tried to bring Confucianism to the West. It's a long story, I won't go into it now, but he was a very important guy, and in 1605 he was in Beijing, and he had a visitor, a guy by the name of Aitian, who was from the city of Kaifeng. Aitian had come to Beijing to participate in the official examination. I don't know if you are aware of the fact, throughout the centuries in China, people who wanted to move up the ranks, who wanted to become clerks, had to go through an examination. There was a series of examinations. The examination was on the Confucian classics. This guy Aitian was coming to take the highest level of examination, the Jianxi, and he had heard that there's a man in town who claims he believes in one God, and that he claims that he's not a Muslim. The Jews knew very well about Islam. Islam arrived in China around the 8th century, a little earlier, and the Jews were very well aware of Islam, also because from a Chinese perspective, Islam and Judaism were very, very similar, and they had to, in fact, the Jews were called those who do not eat the sinews. That was one of their early name was a reference to the Gida Nashe, because as kind of a way of differentiating that between them and the Muslims. From a Chinese perspective, one God, no pork, basically the same, couldn't really differentiate between Islam and Judaism. It was the Jews. As we'll see later, it actually, the need to differentiate between them and Muslims brought some ironic consequences. We'll get to that a little later. When Aitian heard that this man who was a monotheist was sitting in Beijing, he of course assumed that he was Jewish. He went to see him, and as he entered Ricci's room, Ricci and identified himself as a believer in one God. Ricci was very excited because he himself was on his quest to look for Nestorians. The Nestorian church was an ancient church that had come from the Middle East to China and to Mongolia. And had some success at a certain point, but had disappeared. By the time the Jesuits arrived in China, the Nestorians had disappeared. He knew about them because Marco Polo wrote about them, and others had written about meeting Nestorians, but Ricci had never met any Nestorians. So in fact, both people, as they kind of stood in front of each other, were convinced that they had found long-lost brothers. Ricci took him to the prayer room. There was a picture of Mary and her child, and he kneeled. Aitian was convinced that the picture was of Rebecca and Jacob. And he kneeled as well, kind of as very typical Chinese courtesy. And he said to Ricci, apparently, we only have Ricci's account, unfortunately. We don't have, Aitian didn't write about it. Ricci wrote about it. He said that they usually do not worship images, but as far as he's concerned, respect to the ancestors is okay. We'll get back to that point. The Jews of Kaifeng were, by this point, very Chinese, and indeed did revere. They didn't have ancestor worship, but they had in their synagogue a hall for the in honor of the ancestors. Big thing in China, honoring your ancestors. There were also pictures of the apostles. There were Aitian thought it was the tribes, the sons of Yaakov. He asked where were the other 8. There was some misunderstanding. And after a little bit of discussion, Ricci understood that what he had before him was in fact not an historian, but a Jew. He was a little disappointed, but also interested, because here's a Jew in China. Nobody had ever heard about Jews in China. And so we don't know how Aitian reacted, if he was disappointed or not, but he left, and he did inform Ricci about where exactly they were. Ricci sent a letter to the rabbi of the community of Kaifeng, telling them that he had not heard, but there was a new segment to the Bible, and that the Messiah had indeed come while they were in China. And the rabbi, in a very Jewish and a very Chinese way, wrote him back that according to their tradition, the Messiah will not come for another 10,000 years. 10,000 is a way in Chinese of saying a lot. He will not come for another 10,000 years. But since he was at that time quite old, he was willing to pass on the community to Ricci himself. If Ricci wanted to take on the rabbinate of Kaifeng Judaism after him, he was willing to give it to him, but he must stop with his abominable practice of eating pork. He had heard that Ricci was a pork eater. It was that to them, the Chinese, by the way, till this very day, that is the mark of their identity, is not eating pork. In a Chinese context, I don't know if you are aware of this, in Chinese, when the word meat means pork. Usually Chinese people are pork eaters. That's what they eat. So not eating pork is a big thing. Ricci never answered the letter, but what we know is that after the rabbi died, the Jesuits were informed that the person who took over after him was his son, who was quite unlearned. And Ricci wrote, as this kind of a side note at the end of this whole description in his book, he said that he believed that the community was well on their way to become Mohammedan or heathen. Why am I telling you this story? Because this is 1605. In 1605, they were already quite, how should we say, they were already quite on their way to disappearing. Yet, they survived for another 250 years, which is quite amazing. So the fact that Kaifeng Jews survived at all is really pretty dramatic when you think about the fact. And I think that one of the reasons is in a sense kind of random. In the centuries before, during the Ming era, one of the emperors gave the Kaifeng Jews 7 names, 7 family names, and those family names persist till this day. Not all of the clans are still, not all of the families are still found. Apparently, one of them converted to Islam at a certain point. But of the 7, I believe that at least 5 or 6 are still around in one way or in one form or another. So I was one of them. I was one of the family names. Aitian was the guy who went to meet Ricci. So, in fact, the names functioned as some kind of identity for a very, very, very long time. And throughout the centuries after Ricci passed away, the Jesuits kept in touch with this community. They went to visit them every once in a while. We have these are, you may have seen this in Bet HaTfutzot. This is the model of the synagogue. Here is the sketch of the interior of the synagogue, done also by a missionary, a Jesuit missionary who went to visit the community. Maybe he wasn't a Jesuit. A missionary, a French missionary who went to visit the community. There was some contact. There was no contact with Jews at this point, only with Christians. The Christians were very interested in the Kaifeng Jews for, among other reasons, because they were convinced that the Kaifeng Jews had very old writings. It's a very common misconception to equate remote with ancient. The Christians were convinced that the Kaifeng Jews had arrived there before, because they were very far, they must be therefore very, very ancient, that they arrived there during after the first temple's destruction, and that therefore they had the original text of the Torah, and in the original text of the Torah, Jesus would be mentioned, the prophecies would be there. In other words, that what we have today is a censored text of the Torah. They were very disappointed to discover that in fact their scroll was exactly identical to the scrolls that they were acquainted with in Europe. They had this fantasy that they would find evidence, but they were very relentless at trying to get texts. They're trying to buy up texts from the Kaifeng Jews. And the Kaifeng Jews throughout this whole time were persistent at not selling. They did not, or at least very little, there was given out to the missionaries, but the level of knowledge in the community was gradually decreasing. There was less and less left. As I said, there was no contact with outside Jews. We know that, actually, this is fairly old. I don't think you can see it here. This is just names in Chinese and in Chinese and in Hebrew. So this is fairly late, but we know that the last scrolls written, it's clear that they were just copied and that nobody actually knew how to read Hebrew. We're talking about 18th century. So I'm jumping to the 19th century. In the 19th century, what happened? 19th century, there was a big crisis in China. And in a certain sense, the story of the Jews of Kaifeng is the story of China. We're going to see it later in the Reform era. But in the 19th century, in 1840, it was the first Opium War, which was a huge shattering for the Chinese, because it was the first time they understood that, in fact, they were very much behind the world technologically. They had previously considered themselves the center of the universe. I don't know if you're aware of the fact the word for China in Chinese is the Middle Kingdom. I've heard that. Yes, that is. They're very much under the concept that these foreign barbarians were nothing more than barbarians, that they had come to pay when they came for trade and so on, which they did under a very strict system. They would come to pay homage to the emperor. I don't want to go into the story of the 19th century too much, but we should say that the 19th century was usually we start modern Chinese history from 1840. The Opium War was a big crisis, and in fact, with the falling apart of meaning, with the crisis of meaning in the Chinese world, the same thing happened to the Jews of Kaifeng. There was really not very much left. At the same time, there was also, the reason I brought this map is it was also an era of a lot of turmoil. In general, Kaifeng, the synagogue was destroyed a few times. It was destroyed and rebuilt, because the city sits not far from the Yellow River, which floods periodically and does huge damage. It's sometimes called China's sorrow, to the Yellow River. But if you see, I don't have a thing here. That green blotch over there in the center, if you see right above it is ка이фנג. That was a big rebellion. It's kind of far to see, but there were two very large rebellions. Is it this? Oh yeah, there it is. Yeah. Here we go. ка이фנг is this dot over here. The reason I'm showing you this map is because just to see that the 19th century was really a time of calamity. There was this kind of purpley thing was the Taiping Rebellion. Taiping Rebellion was a huge calamity, cost the lives of apparently tens of millions of people. The dynasty is starting to fall apart. This green blotch over here was another big rebellion called the Nien Rebellion. Also caused a lot of bloodshed and destruction. And basically, by the time we arrive in the mid-19th century, with these calamities, the destruction of the synagogue from a flood at a certain point, and the crisis of meaning in the whole throughout China, the community basically ceases to exist. The last synagogue is destroyed. The last rabbi dies. There's nobody really to take his place, even in a nominal sense, and the community kind of disappears. As I said, it's quite amazing that they survived as long as they did, but that was basically it. In the early 20th century, there was an attempt by Jews from Hong Kong and Shanghai, I think, to contact the remnants of the community in kа이фנг, but nobody answered. There may have been nobody to answer. My father wrote an article in 1987 about the Jews of kа이фנг, which I will return to later, in which he theorizes that it's possible that nobody answered because at that time it was already becoming not so popular to be in contact with foreigners. To have contact with foreigners, China was at that time very anti-foreign for obvious and legitimate reasons. It was in a state of semi-colonialism, abused and divided, and having contact with foreign people was not such a great thing to have, and the kа이фנг Jews were not interested. It's a plausible explanation. We don't know. May or may not be. I should say, by the way, kind of as a side note, kа이фנг at this point is already quite a backwater. It was a very important city at the time, but now it's kind of the sticks, as they say. It's not a very important city. Even today, it's only about 1.5 million people, which is it's not even the provincial capital of Henan. So it's not really a very important place already, and it's quite poor, and it is poor today as well. So the Jews there are really kind of, or the remnants of the Jews, are really kind of fighting for their existence on a day-to-day level. Things are pretty bad. I should also say that at this point already, or probably quite a long time before, there are no halachic Jews. The community intermarried pretty quickly. Lack of anti-Semitism helps with that. They intermarried, and apparently, when in a Chinese way, they went according to the father, patrilineal descent. So none of them were Jews at this point, but they did consider themselves. Names are very important, as I will stress a number of times today. Names are very important in the Chinese tradition. Names and family names. So they had this concept of themselves as Yisraelia, which meant Israel, and later they had the concept Yotai, which meant Jewish. This is something that they didn't really know very much what it meant, but they had this concept that their fathers had come from somewhere else, and they held on to it. I'm jumping now to the reason I brought this picture is just to see that throughout the 19th century. Wait, I'll get back to it. Throughout the 19th century, another thing that happened is that any artifacts that were in the city were taken away. All the scrolls, all the, Some were bought up by local mosques. Much of it was taken away to Canada, to the US, to the United Kingdom. So there's really nothing left. The only thing that's left is this hole in the ground where that woman is sitting. That is the well of the Bet Knesset. That's it. That is what there is to see. The Bet Knesset, there's a hospital there now. There's nothing there in the yard. If you pay somebody, you can go and see a hole in the ground. It's kind of a strong metaphor, I think, for the community. There's really nothing left except for a hole in the ground in an actual physical sense. I'm skipping over 150 years now. There's 150 years of really not very much happening. But in the Reform era, something has reawoken. The Reform era, let's just say a few words about the Reform era. Since Mao Zedong died in 1976, or really, to be more accurate, in 1979, Deng Xiaoping opens up China. And it's the beginning of the Reform era. Maybe I should preface and say that before the Reform era in the Maoist period, anything that had to do with religion and ethnic identity was oppressed. The Kaifeng Jews weren't oppressed because there really wasn't very much to oppress. Apparently the steels that we saw in these steels were almost destroyed. I met somebody in Kaifeng who apparently saved them, and in the effort to destroy everything old. But you can't really talk about oppression of the community because there was nobody really there to oppress. But they definitely weren't talking about their identity because it was not really something that you did. But in the Reform era, we have a blossoming and an explosion of religion in China, of every sort of religion. Buddhism is big, you know, all kinds of folk religions, the worship of Qigong practices. Maybe you've heard of the Falun Gong, another religious movement that in the 90s that was, that popped out of nowhere and suddenly had 30 million believers. Christianity is huge in China. Christianity may have as much as 100 million believers in Protestant Christianity, which is a lot even in China. Islam is kind of more among the Muslim community, but it's definitely, there's a revival of religion, especially in the province of Henan, where Kaifeng is situated. Henan is a province that, I just want to show you the cover of this book. This is a book that came out a few years ago called Henan, the Galilee of China, by a missionary scholar by the name of Paul Hadaway. Henan is considered one of the centers of Chinese underground Christianity, house churches, what they call it, Christianity that is not official. We're talking about, it's a province that has 100 million people. We're talking about many millions of Christians, and some of these Jews are also kind of interested in reviving their identity. At the same time, another process is happening. Not only is religion blossoming, ethnicity is blossoming in China, and part of that blossoming is actually government orchestrated. I want to show you this poster. I should say China has 56 recognized nationalities, and China in the past few years is trying to promote itself very much under the slogan of as a multinational state. We see it here as a poster from a few years ago, 2008. Here you see all the ethnic minorities of China in their costumes, and I think the message here is very clear. They're standing here, they're quite small, and in the background is the symbol of power, the Beijing, the imperial, even one could even say the imperial power. It's a celebration of ethnicity under the auspices of the party and of the state. The state is very much present here. What it says here is Minzu Tuanjie, means the unity of minorities. The unity of minorities is what is Puten Tongjie, something like that. Is infinite happiness or something like that. Very much a celebration of some of you may have noticed in the Olympics, in the opening ceremony of the Olympics, it was very present. This kind of bringing out these ethnic minorities with their costumes. It's a very much kind of the new face of China. It's not just one. It's not just Han Chinese. It's all these ethnicities together, but very much under the guidance of the one. I should say Han Chinese are 92% of the population. So power is very clear. We can go into that, but maybe later. But with this kind of dual trend of religion is in and ethnicity is religion is interesting and in sometimes, not always. Religion is also oppressed sometimes in China, but it's popular, and ethnicity is in. Suddenly we find that there are Jews in Kaifeng, that people who are kind of have become interested again in expressing their identity. These are the descendants of the community. And now I'd like to turn to the second part of this. Was kind of background, kind of trying to describe what is there today from my experience and from people I spoke to and met. So first of all, as I said, the community was never very large, and I'm sure you're wondering about numbers, so I'll say not entirely clear, but we're talking about maybe there are about 500 people. There may be, I've heard assessments that say maybe a couple thousand in a kind of a larger circle. But in actuality, the people who, when we were there, for example, we were there for Sukkot, so usually for Shabbats, maybe there are about, I don't know, maybe 15 or 20 people for a regular Shabbat. In each of the schools, there are 2 schools. I'll get back to that in a minute. Why are there 2 schools? Yeah, it's kind of an obvious Jewish thing, but and on Sukkot there were maybe about 40 people. So we're talking about maybe about 100 people who are really active on a regular basis as kind of a core circle. In the outer circle, maybe a few hundred more. Not very large. But Kaifeng, I should say, as kind of a side note, is a city where you can walk on the streets. Happened to me twice, and people will stop you and say, "Oh, you're Jewish." We're also Jewish. You speak Ivrit. It happened to me twice in a period of 2 weeks. So that's kind of remarkable in a Chinese city, where usually people, people have heard of Jews, but definitely will have no idea about what that means. So there are 2 schools. When I mean schools, I mean that they're community centers where people come and learn. They learn Hebrew. They learn a little bit about the Chagim. They learn some English and some other things. And they also come for Kabbalat Shabbat, and they have communal meals, and they're community centers. There have been teachers coming in and out of Kaifeng. There are a number of organizations working in Kaifeng, and they're mostly individuals, just private individuals coming in and out. The organization that is most active there, I believe, is Shavei Israel. It's an organization that is dedicated to work among descendants of Jews, people who are from Mizera Israel. They're active among the Bnei Menashe in India. If you know, they're active among Anusim. They're active among a number of groups. They're also active to some degree among the Jews of Kaifeng. As I said, there's nothing to see in Kaifeng. There's basically there's no artifact. There is. Interesting, when my father wrote the article in 1987, he writes that the municipal government of Kaifeng is excited about building a museum. That is no longer, that was the case in the 80s. That may have been the case in the 80s. It's no longer the case. They're not excited about it. They're kind of more hesitant about it for reasons that I will get to at the end of the lecture. I should just say that the museum, which has the steels, is very cheap, like most Chinese museums. But to see the steels, you have to pay another 50 yuan, which is really a lot of money in Chinese standards. It's strange. It's kind of kept almost kind of far from. It's not emphasized. You can see what you can see is this. There's a small street where it's called the Teaching of the Torah Lane. See, they wrote it in Hebrew too. This is right next to where the Beit Knesset used to be. You can go there. It's just a very small alley. There is a young woman who lives there with her family, a descendant of the Zhao clan, who was apparently they took care of the Beit Knesset, who has a little museum in her house. She is trying to promote this idea of. She is trying to promote actually the reconstruction of the synagogue. It's kind of a sore subject because the community is not really behind her in that effort. Don't want to make too many waves. I'll talk about that in a minute. You can see some. There is. I should preface and say, there is, in addition to Shavei Yisrael, and that's really I think kind of the new thing about communities like the Jews of Kaifeng. Shavei Yisrael helps promote Orthodox conversion for those who want it. I've emphasized for those who want it. It does not go out and try and spread the word of the Torah. It's not a missionary organization, but it does try, and for those who are interested, it does try and promote conversion. There have been 4 girls who have already converted, and there are seven young men who I taught here who have gone through the process. So there are a few young people who have converted at this point. The older people of the community or the middle-aged people of the community are not particularly interested or do not seem to be very much, it doesn't seem that it's so urgent to them to convert. The feeling I got there is that the fact that they're in contact with Jews again, that they're on the map of the Jewish world, that is enough. For their purposes, they're Jewish now. They call themselves Jewish, but it's very much an interest of theirs to see the young people of the community go through conversion. Now, the reason I say Shavei Yisrael is an organization that promotes Orthodox conversion is because there are other organizations, and there are other options today. And apparently in the past few years, some of the younger people of the community have been sent to America, where there are, shall we say, conversions that take less time and possibly less efforts. So they're not the only show in town, in a sense. Now, I also mentioned the fact, before I return to the issue of what kind of the way they express their identity, I also mentioned the fact that there are 2 schools. Why are there 2 schools? I don't want to go into too much into the politics of the community, but what happened is that we've seen that from the beginning, missionaries have taken a very strong interest in the Kaifeng Jews. And it's possible that one of the first school established, I don't want to say for sure, the first school established has had certain contacts possibly with some Christians or Jews for Jesus, Messianic Jews. That is the background for the fact that there is now a new school which is funded by Shavei Yisrael. Now, this is denied by the person who founded the first school, so I don't want to say anything for sure. But I will say that when I met a missionary friend of mine in Yunnan, the first thing he asked me when I went to Kaifeng is, are there Messianic Jews working there? He immediately identified that that would be the logic, to send a Messianic Jew to work among the Kaifeng Jews. So, and I do know that there are Hong Kong Christians who have been kind of in touch with the community. I saw even at the house of this woman, which I'll speak about her in a minute, I saw a calendar that they printed, a Jewish Chinese calendar printed by Christians with things from both the Bible and the New Testament. And you can imagine that these people are very they really don't have a sense of discernment. They can't really tell between, I mean, they say we're not Christians at all, we're Jewish, but they can't really tell what is what, so it's very sensitive. That's why Shavei Sled established this separate school and kind of wanted to cut its ties more or less with the original school. But I should say that when I went to the original school, there was no overt Christian anything there that I could see. When I spoke to the people, they didn't seem to have. So I don't know if there are missionaries there, when they're planning on, kind of taking the rabbit out of the hat and saying, oh, by the way, Jesus. I don't know if that's ever going to happen or what the plan is, but so far there's no evidence of it. So, but we should remember that there is the Orthodox option is not the only option for Jews of Kaifeng. There's Shavei Sled. There's an organization called Kulanu, which you may have heard of. The organization which is much more inclusive. It's more like Jewish ethnicity. Anybody they don't really promote conversion. It's an organization active in a lot of places, many places in the world. It used to be the American branch of Shavei Sled. It's actually a break-off. And they're active in Kaifeng, and there's a missionary option, possibly. There are a number of rumors in that region. Maybe some of you have knowledge about that you can share with me. I wanted to show this picture. This is a woman I met on the street, and notice this X on her door. This is apparently an old tradition about the Jews of Kaifeng to mark the doorposts, Pesach thing. They have no idea why or what they did it. It somehow evolved into an X on the door at a certain point. I don't really know very much about it. This is one of the only traditions that is left, and this woman did it. Notice this. This is interesting. This is a woman who is of Jewish descent. She's one of the families. Of course, not halachically Jewish, but of one of the families. Her husband was a Chinese man, not Jewish descent, and she lived in Shenzhen in the east for many years. When her husband died, this is the gravestone she did for him. She doesn't know very much, but she put the letters on the gravestone. This is a picture of a picture. It's kind of in bad quality, but you see the Aleph Bet here. She wanted to kind of celebrate the fact that she was Jewish. It's strange in a sense because her husband is a very Chinese grave. Her husband was not Jewish, but yet she wanted to. It was important enough for her to express her Judaism. She put it on a tombstone. Also, kind of very Chinese thing, dafka on the tomb. Here, this is. Here's our people. We ate at their house. You might know Gao Chao. He's the Chazan of the community, and Levana, his wife, from an old Jewish family. I brought this picture to show they have this in their house. Another way of showing their kind of affinity and relationship to Judaism. So they are identified. They are very much identified, and they do their Kabbalat Shabbat every Shabbat. They meet this is something that I realize they do that whether I'm there or not. They have their tefillah. Some parts of the tefillah have been translated. They've learned some songs. It's all new. There's nothing that they have retained. The only thing that they've retained from what I've heard from the guys here is that they didn't eat pork. They didn't go and worship in temples. So in a sense, they kind of converted to a non-religion. They didn't convert out. They just kind of dropped religion altogether. And they didn't marry Muslims, which is ironic in a sense. I mean, because it was necessary to differentiate between them and Islam because of the proximity, they didn't marry Muslims, but they did marry Han Chinese. So it's kind of one of the things that identity is a very, very, very fluid thing. The other thing is that many people, I should probably kind of bring things to a close, so a few minutes all. The other thing is that many of the people in the community are only married to descendants. And in fact, some of the most active members of the community and most identified members of the community have no relationship whatsoever to the Jewish past. So, again, identity is very, very fluid. They say, yeah, I believe Judaism. I have faith in Judaism. What can you say to that? It's kind of a, well, everybody will take it as they, but it definitely poses problems for an organization like Shavei Israel, which is, do you encourage this? You know, how this is kind of a new situation for the Jewish world in general. You have these people who are genuinely interested in Judaism. One of the members of the community, I should just say, actually was so dedicated that he went and got himself circumcised, even though he's not of Jewish descent at all. But he said, nobody is going to come to give me a giyur. I can't afford to go anywhere else, and so he just went and did it. I should also say, I should add this, that Kaifeng is a very poor city. And it really, in many senses, it's a place that looks like it's only recently kind of joined the current of modernization in China. It's quite gray, it's dirty, it's very third worldish. It looks apparently like the way China looked in the 80s. Broken pavements, very polluted. And part of the incentive for people is to get the kids out of there. So there is that there too. I'm not saying these people are very dedicated. I just want to show you a picture of our sukkah. It's not a very good picture. You can see how gray the city is. This is on the roof. This is the sukkah, the gray thing over there. The building of the sukkah on the roof of the building was not really authorized by the landlord of the building. He, in fact, not only was it not really authorized, he said no. But we were lucky, and he was going away. It was just at the time of Spring Festival, of Autumn Festival, sorry, and New Year's, and not New Year's, Independence Day, and he went away, and we built it, and thought, but what was dramatic and was amazing to me is that the roof was locked, and the members of the community were willing to break the lock, to break in and build it illegally, knowing that they could really get into trouble. So they are, I'm just telling you this to show that they are very dedicated and that they are willing to do it. It's not a simple thing in China to break the law. They may have had their ways to get out of it. That's another thing about China. You never know really who's the authority. Finally, we found somebody who surprisingly had the key, and he opened it, and we did it, and Baruch Hashem, we had real miracle. The sukkah was there throughout the Chag, and nobody bothered us. But this is just to show that they really are quite dedicated and willing to do things even out of the box, not so simple for Chinese. I just want to say a few words at the end about the way the state views this phenomena, which is kind of, in a sense, is kind of the question that's in the background all the time. We should see this picture. This is a picture of a Chinese identity card taken out in 1987, quite late, and here it still says Yotai. They were able to write in their identity card that they were Jewish. Apparently, the clerks there didn't care. They said Jewish, whatever. But that is no longer the case. Since the 90s, the Chinese government has made a decision. You have to make a choice. You're either Hui, which means the Muslim ethnicity, or you're Han, but you have to make a choice. There is no Jewish minority in China. As I said, there are 56 nationalities in China. And Judaism is not one of them. So you have to make a decision. Why? The reason has nothing to do with being anti-Jewish in any way. The Chinese government is not anti-Jewish. The story is that the list of ethnic minorities in China is a closed list. When it was compiled in the 1950s, there were over 400 groups that wanted to be recognized as a minzu, as a nationality. The Chinese government does not want to reopen that box. Once they reopen that box, everybody, there are hundreds, as I said, hundreds of groups who would want status. there are all kinds of legal there are all kinds of legal benefits. Being ethnic is in. There are a lot of good sides to being ethnicity. There's some negative sides, but generally speaking, in Reform era China, being an ethnic minority is rather good. And not to mention of the fact of the resurgent identity that it can bring with all its pekalach. They are not interested in reopening the list of minorities. Therefore, Jews are doing a little bit of Jewish religion within a limited scale. In other words, the schools operate in Kaifeng. Everybody knows there are foreigners there who come and go. There are foreigners there who stay for a while and teach. They're stationed usually at the University of Hainan there and teach them Hebrew. They're in and out of that school. The authorities know. There's no way that they don't know that those schools exist. And they don't seem to mind. They don't seem to be fairly kind of oblivion to it. But there are limits in China. Things are, remember this picture. Yeah, this is there's somebody watching here. Everything is done within the background of this. This is very nice, all this jubilation and laughing, song and dance. The minorities are famous for their singing and dancing, but there is an authority. The authority will not allow to activity that is beyond a certain scale. So there is talk of rebuilding the synagogue. There is this woman who's trying to promote it. If that does happen, it will only be within the state auspices, and it will probably be a museum, definitely not a house of worship. It'll be, if it happens, it'll be a museum and a tourist trap. Things are kept very much in kind of a delicate control. I'd like to conclude by saying that my father wrote in that article, in the article in 1987, that his guess was that the Jews of Kaifeng would become Jews, even though there were no Jews there at the time. He didn't actually visit Kaifeng. He just spoke to people who had been there. But his assessment was that the Jews of the West will make them Jews. That's what he writes there. And I think that in many ways that is happening, indeed. You know, there are, in fact, that identity label of Yotairen has really returned to Kaifeng. They do identify as such. He says there that it's not that he doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to become halachically Jewish, which I really don't see happening in a large-scale way. We should also say that there are the problems of the Israeli government. We didn't even speak about that. Converting them is, we have problems on our side. It's not so simple. But definitely there are not going to be any conversions in China, for sure, in the near future. That kind of thing doesn't really happen there. But they are on their way. Some are converting here, as I said, some of the young people, but they are on their way to kind of rediscovering or re-embracing that identity for whatever it's worth. But anything that will happen there will be slow, gradual, I believe, and very much under government control. I should say that I was reminded here today that it's actually kind of an auspicious day, as the Chinese say, to have this lecture, because the group of seven young men who were at this yeshiva here at Givat HaMiftar are actually going through their conversion today. I was at their Beit Din a month ago. Today they are, it's kind of funny that it was scheduled for today from above, obviously. They are going through their conversion, and they're, we hope that they will be accepted well into the community here. Not simple to be a Chinese Jew with all that is for a separate lecture. So I think we conclude with that. Should I stand or no? Let's sit. I don't.
Are the lights on? Thank you. Well, thank you, Gidon, for that.
Don't hear you.
Elazar house on a Shabbat maybe 25 years ago, and Dan and Harriet were going, I think, the next day to China. Dan and Harriet were on the way to China. Dan had been invited, I believe, by the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and he had consulted a friend of his who knew something about China. And he said, look, they'll all ask you, what's the population of Israel? And he said, lie. Tell them it's 25 million. They'll still laugh at you because they won't believe that a country that can make so much noise is only 25 million. But if you say 5, they won't even take you seriously. Right. David.
The seven who are converting, are they staying in Israel or are they going back to their community?
Oh yeah, they're staying. First of all, they have to do the army to some degree. They're all in their 20s, so they have to do at least a little bit. Yes, they're staying. If they didn't stay in Israel, it would be much simpler, actually. They could do a private conversion. But because they're staying in Israel, they had to do the official, and it's Misad Apnim and everything. I don't see any reason why they'll return to... I think one of them actually is thinking of going back and being the rabbi there, but I'm not sure what their plans are in the long term. But for at least for the short term, they're here. Yeah.
I have two questions. The picture that you showed of the woman with the X on her door, there was something white on the right.
It's a mezuzah, yeah.
Okay, I just wondered about that. Another question, is this comparable to other cities, the Jewish population, the Jewish activity comparable to other cities in China?
There is no Jewish activity in any other city in China. The Kaifeng Jews are the only ancient community in China. It's a unique phenomenon. None of the Jews, after the Silk Road was closed in the late 14th century, we don't know what happened to those communities. There were other communities all over China, apparently, Hangzhou and other places. They disappeared. They left. The only Jews in China, except for the Kaifeng Jews, are recent businessmen who are, in Beijing and Shanghai, there are Jews, but they're Western Jews. It's a different story. They're not Chinese citizens.
What about Shanghai?
Shanghai has non-Chinese citizens, but they're foreign Jews who are there doing business. It has a sizable community, but it's a different story. It's a story of the relationship between foreign nationals who are doing their religious thing. But these people are Chinese. It's as far as the government is concerned, it's a different story. There are Chabad houses in China, and they function more or less openly. They're not supposed to allow Chinese in, theoretically. It's understood that it's only for Jews. But they function in the east, mostly in the east of China.
Any more questions?
You mentioned about writings, that there are no writings anymore. But the writing that did come from China, you said they were sold or taken over. What kind of writings did they have?
There's a Torah. There's a Sefer Torah. There's a Sefer Torah that is in Canada, I think. I'm not sure where exactly. Yes, there's a scroll in a box and everything. There was a Haggadah that they found. There's some other documents, No, there was nothing. No, there was. No, there's no shoot. As far as I know, there was no contact with the outside. almost, at least not in the memorable past. Yeah.
Peter, you mentioned that ethnicity is in, but the Chinese are quelling the Tibetans, aren't they?
Yeah, some ethnicity is in it. Yeah, and in Xinjiang, ethnicity it's very much in the spirit of the picture. Ethnicity is under the auspices of Han guidance. In other words, the idea is the Chinese still hold to the socialist kind of. There's a scale of progress. Every ethnic group is classified according to their stage in their evolvement. They're either slave or feudal, or if you remember those Marxist theories, or and of course the most advanced are the Han. The Han are those who are supposed to guide all the other ethnicities towards socialism, towards the future. So it's very much the problem with the Tibetans and with the Uyghurs is that they're not so much interested in that scheme of things. They want to do their own thing. So ethnicity is, yes, it's controlled.
Is there any university studies, that is, courses in universities on Judaism or in Israel?
Yeah.
I was just there about 3
Can you
weeks
just say
ago.
who you are?
I'm Harold Rode, and I just spent 3.5 weeks in China lecturing on Jews, Israel and Judaism for an organization here called Signal, which is a joint Israel-Chinese academic organization. For example, Kaifan, they have both an Israel and a Jewish center. They're very, very interested. They are not allowed, whatever that means, to have any contact with the Jewish community. It was a fascinating experience, to try to look. This is your name. I don't want.
No, by all means. Here.
בסדר, אם את רוצה, זה בסדר. אוקיי. רגע, זה עובד? זה בסדר? אוקיי.
בבקשה.
אוקיי, נו.
בבקשה. אני לא בעל הבית.
אבל זה ההצעה שלך, לא שלי. אפשר? אוקיי. Look, I just spent the last 3.5 weeks, or I'm here now for about 2 weeks, running around China in all sorts of cities. There are Israel centers, there are Jewish centers, and with a kippah on, and I had a 21-year-old guy who from birth speaks Chinese, who shomer mitzvot with me, also from Washington, D.C. And we, shall we say, sort of demonstrated how Jews think, because I'm 63, he's 21, he's a third of my age, and when he didn't agree with what I was saying, we had sort of a Talmudic discussion of sorts. But the goal was to show what how Jews think, because they're obsessed with this, they're fascinated with this. They're obsessed with Little Israel. The first city we went to was a place called Chongqing, which is in southwest China. And there are 30 million people in this city. And we tried to explain, look, from all the Jews in the world, you could fit, like 2.5 times all the Jews in this city. The Chinese had a little difficulty understanding, just again, as Gidon said here before, they had a difficulty understanding numbers when you say that in Israel. What is in Israel? There are 6.4, who knows what, million Jews. And that means, it's 4.5 times of all the Jews of Israel could fit into this city. Even though they're studying Jewish things, and they're really very, very interested and fascinated by Israel, it's a little odd. They really don't get it. And for example, simply on Kaifeng, which is really what this was all about, and I want to ask, please, a question, if you don't mind. In Kaifeng itself, we were told by Shavei Israel, we were in contact with Shavei Israel before we went, and we were told, don't tell the people at the university what you're doing. And it was a little difficult because we had all these formal dinners, and we said for Kabbalat Shabbat, we explained them we were going to be doing this ourselves. Well, they were right, we were doing, but we weren't doing it exactly the way they said. We went to the first of the two communities. I must tell you, it was both moving and strange. They all, of course, don't look like us. Whatever us looks like, they look different. And as Gidon said here, the head of the community is not Jewish. He has no Jewish blood in him. There are a lot of, it seems, spouses, men who support their wives, who are very active in this. I don't know what a lot means. You know a lot more about the numbers than I do. But it was sort of, I want to almost say at times surrealistic. When it came, for example, to Kabbalat Shabbat, they have their Sidurim, which are in Chinese. There's no Hebrew. And when we came to the Shema, you had people who were saying things, and all of a sudden we hear, "Ve'ahavta et Hashem Elokecha b'chol levavcha b'chol nafshecha b'chol me'odecha." Whatever. The point is, this trope, this tune, is purely Ashkenazi, and it is what Gidon said. These people have nothing historically in connection with them. Now, of the 7 families, the family Jewish names, one of my obsessions in life, Shalom and I are obsessive genealogists here, and I took some DNA samples from the men. Whose line are man. I also have ones whose females and then their mans. It's a lot harder to deal with them, and I don't think we're going to learn much from them. But we'll see who and what they are, because their theories. And please, I am an expert on Islam. I am not an expert on the Jews of Kaifang. But how could we not, being in this place for about a week, how could we not see them? The first community, I think this guy Tim, which is it appears to be a missionary guy.
It's not clear.
Yeah, it's something is unclear. I was told it's something to do with Christians, and by them, I wasn't sure what. Anyway, he was, he apparently was coming back and forth. There was a guy named Ari that they told me was about to come the next day from the United States. Ich weiß, I don't really know. But can I just ask one question? On the wall of the first community was a letter from clearly in Hebrew, which of course nobody could read except us, from about the 1840s, from Kulur Shanghai, asking, tell us about your community. Tell what do you need? What books do you have? What books do you need? Because we'll be happy to supply if we can. We know nothing about whether there are any answers. No one even knew what it was on the wall, except they had a picture of this. I don't know. But again, you're the expert. I'm just a traveler. So anyway,
I just want to say before I answer your question, something that you mentioned, which is important, I think, kind of to understand a larger context. I think Judaism is very much, as you may have experienced, as you said, it's kind of an exclusive club to belong to in China. For what you hear from any taxi driver that you meet in China is that Jews are very smart. They have this concept of Jews that is very, very, they don't know anything, but it's something that really Einstein, everybody talks about Einstein. I heard it for a whole year every day. It drove me crazy already about Einstein, but it's and Marx, yeah, Einstein and Marx, yeah, they're smart Jews. So it's an exclusive club to belong to that could also explain why some people are interested in it. Just kind of as a side note, with regard to the letter, we know there was no answer sent. It was too late. There was nobody there who could read. It was too late, and things had become very, very difficult by that time, physically difficult in the community. There was no time for that kind of thing. So yeah, it remains unanswered. If it had come maybe even 50 years early, it's possible that there was still somebody. Probably nobody read Hebrew for a long time before, but maybe there were enough people who were interested in the contact. But by the time it arrived, it was.
Professor Avineri.
You mentioned that identity is very fluid, and this is obvious. And my question. You mentioned that identity is very fluid, and this is obvious. And my question is the following. I mean, we know how those people, you call them community, but let's say people, were referred to by the Han Chinese. What was their self-identification? When they say they are Jewish, or the 7 families that have Jewish roots, what term were they using? They were certainly not using the external Chinese term, which has to do with not eating pork. Do they have a self...
They were using the word at the beginning. They were using, when they first arrived, they used the term Yisalia.
How do we know this?
It's in the steels.
It says Israelia.
Yisalia, actually in a different way than it's written today, but it's a transliteration. Yisalia, that was the name that they used. That we know for sure. I don't know, and I'm sure somebody does know, when the term Yotai came in, because we know that Aitien, when he met Matteo Ricci, was not aware of that term. He knew Yisalia. He didn't know Yotairen. Yotai is, again, the transliteration of Yehudi. Yes, those are the terms they use, and in many senses that was all they knew was that term. The kids, the boys I spoke to here, didn't know anything about a god when they were growing up. All they knew was that name, the family names, and the pork prohibition, which was not even necessarily observed by the time they grew up. But they knew that they bought from Muslim butchers, or at least tried to buy food from Muslim butchers, but didn't marry their daughters. Yeah.
First of all, I identify myself, David Parsons, with the Christian Embassy next door, and I think our Taiwan branch made a donation for the studies of these 7 students recently to Shavei Israel. But we're also involved with bringing the B'nai Menashe, cooperating with Shavei Israel for that. We've just sponsored the first group to come. And my question is, have you come to some conclusions about the apparent connection between the B'nai Menashe? Did they come out of the Kaifeng community centuries ago?
I'm not an expert, to be honest. I don't see any evidence of that, really. But the problem with the B'nai Menashe is, of course, we have no written history before the 19th century. So there's really, it's all oral. So the question is what place you give to oral history, and that's kind of more of almost a personality thing. You know, it's different historians tend to give more emphasis to oral histories than other. I don't know, but I don't see any direct evidence to the Kaifeng Jews, and in fact, I don't think that they claim, because I mean, the narratives are totally different. One is that it's a 10 lost tribe, the Menashe, and the Kaifeng Jews do not claim to be the lost tribes. They claim to be Jews who came from Persia and from Central Asia. So I don't see any connection necessarily.
I have a different kind of question. It doesn't relate to the Kaifeng Jews or to Jews so much as it relates to China itself. I've read recently that China has a vast eugenic program. And they actually sterilize many people who they consider inferior, and their great respect for Jews and their intelligence is because of their own massive program to develop a superior intelligence society which will dominate the world. What do you think? Do you think that's nonsense, or do you think it's
I think it's pretty close to nonsense. Yeah, I'll be honest. I mean, I think that it's. First of all, I'll say at a few levels. It has nothing to do with the popular level feeling towards Jews. The popular level feeling towards Jews. I mean, in other words, the man in the streets just knows that Jews are very smart. He doesn't know anything more about Jews. It's interesting, the Chinese, what they like about Jews is what they like about their own tradition, that much of it has been lost. In other words, their emphasis is on education, family. These are all Confucian ideals, which the Chinese have lost, and they recognize in the Jews. It's basically their longing for their own tradition in many ways. So that, I think that's really the popular level. What happens on the government level is something that I don't think we really know about. I don't know about the eugenics program. Maybe you've read something I haven't. I don't think the Chinese usually and historically don't think in racial terms. That's very un-Chinese. Chinese think in cultural terms. People can be cultured. People can become. That's again the emphasis on education. People are raised from a very young age. Children are always educated from the age of nothing. They're educated. The emphasis is on. Chinese believe that man is born good. That was one of the big points of contentions with Christianity, and that man can self-cultivate himself. So it's very ingrained, the educational concept, not so much a racial concept of racial blending. And we see that throughout history, peoples, all kinds of barbarians, became Chinese because Chinese was about it was about culture. It wasn't about race so much. So this kind of eugenics thing sounds to me like a deviation from the does it exist? Possibly, I don't know, but I don't think it has anything to do with the Jewish thing. That's my feeling. Yeah. Okay, I'd be happy to read it. Yeah.
Thank you very much. There's a very old joke about the American tourist who is in Kaifeng, and he goes on Shabbat to the synagogue, and the Gabbai comes up to him and he says, "You Jewish?" And he says, "Sure." And he says, "Funny, you don't look it."
It's not a joke. It happened to his grandparents.
Okay.
When they were in China, they were also asked, "What, you really are Jews? You don't even look Jewish."
Okay.
My grandparents?
Yeah, Nettie and Albert.
They were in China?
And the other thing I wanted to say was that
They took a trip around the world.
that in the Far East in general, there are small Chinese communities who are always at the top of the tree in terms of economic and other achievements, and they were known as the Jews of the East. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, that's another affinity that they like to find, another similarity they like to find between themselves and Jews. They have a diaspora, and their diaspora is very successful, and it kind of works in a similar way to a certain extent to Jewish diasporas. These are families. It's very family based. And they usually, in fact, it's true that they are in places like Malaysia, for example, they are the backbone of business, of finances, the Chinese. There's also a city in China, there's a city called Wenzhou, with a lot of Christians, which is called the Jerusalem. They're also called they're not the Jews, they're also called the Jews of China, because they're very, very good at business. Yes, they have, that is another thing that that's kind of the other side of this talk about, Jewish intelligence, is, they have this concept of Jews as being very, very good at finances. I would always say to them, and that I'm sorry that nobody told me the secrets about Jewish finances. I was kind of left out. I don't know how the secret didn't get to me about how to make money, but they're very convinced that's a big
You
thing.
obviously don't have any Chinese blood.
Apparently not.
Okay. Thank you very, very much, Gidon. I think we all gained tremendously, and we look forward to hearing you again at JCPA.